Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to this session, kind of called What Happens Next? Navigating the Future with Your Neurodivergent Child. This is a series that is being hosted by Indiana LEND, which is an organization that every state has, a LEND program, that's Leadership and Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. And every year they have a cohort of fellows. Some of them are clinicians, some of them are family advocates, some of them are self-advocates, and then they lead a project. And so this is part of that series. Can I have a next slide, please? Yeah, okay. Anyway, this is me. I'm Rue Williams. I am an academic researcher. I'm an assistant professor at Purdue in the Polytechnic. I do research on technology, disability, and politics. And I teach technology design and ethics. And I'm also an autistic parent of autistic children. And again, just what I said about LEND, I should have said when this slide was on, but I said it before. So there you go. And the LEND in Indiana is hosted out of the University of Indiana, but it's actually specifically hosted out of like Riley Physicians in Indianapolis. So, hi, thank you. And so that's where they are, and it's a really great program. And if you're interested, they really do a lot for interested people who want to be family advocates. It's very nice. So some of you may know that I sent out a survey before the session started, and I wanted to gather some perspectives from people about how they're feeling. And so, we had, in total now, there's almost 40 responses to the survey. And when asked about their feelings around diagnosis, we had sort of two different distributions. We had shock and fear, and we had like relief and validation. So we had people who were already convinced that their child was autistic or ADHD or had some other kind of neurodevelopmental condition, and were relieved to be getting the diagnosis that they needed to get the correct kind of services for their children. And then we had the people who weren't really quite prepared for it and were surprised and didn't really know what to do next. Neither of these feelings are better or worse than the other. It's just something then to know that everybody has a different experience of what's happening here. One thing to know is that for people who are already certain that their child has a condition and are seeking diagnosis, they can be very frustrated by the fight to get diagnosis. And that would be one big reason why they have relief, right? Because it's basically like, told you. Anyway, so the survey also asked about your concerns for the present. And these were very common. There was emotional regulation concerns about aggression, concerns about sadness and anxiety and fear, concerns about friendships, making and keeping friendships, concerns about education, their access to education, and their how they are treated at school, and then achieving goals. And this is very specifically like achieving the goals that the child themselves are interested in achieving. And then concerns for the future, people were very concerned about the idea of success for their children. Will they be independent? Will they have their own job? Will they go to college? There's lots of things about, I'm sorry that I'm laughing, it's mean. Hold on, I'm sorry. So there are a lot of people who are like, I wonder if my child will ever get married. And the reason that I'm laughing is a trauma response, actually. So it is actually really common that even today, children are told that they may not ever get married. I was at a group for autistic students at the University of Florida, and I was a master's student at the time. And one of the undergrad students was crying in the session because when he asked his therapist if he could ever be a father, they said, we just don't have enough research about that. And it's very frustrating that professionals will only go based on the research when the research only studies things that certain people find interesting. Anyway, yes, it is very possible that your child will find somebody to love, okay? And that somebody will love them. Worries about that they could live independently, and we'll talk about that some, and worried about like their security, in particular, worried about what will happen to their children after they die, which is a big concern, and we can talk about also. I'm going to start by talking about some cognitive concepts, and the reason why I want to talk about these is because these are things that are not commonly described in your basic autism materials, but this is actually what research has shown to be autistic people's primary concern. So executive dysfunction. First, I'll describe that executive functions are cognitive processes that govern goal-oriented behavior and action. The idea of like motor planning and sustained attention and task switching. And that we know from research that neurodevelopmental conditions like autism and ADHD have a demonstrated impairment or difficulty with executive functions or with things that are influenced by executive functions. There are many other contributing factors to executive dysfunction, such as other mental health conditions, depression and OCD, which many autistic people have also, and also conditions of aging, such as menopause and mild cognitive impairment, and injuries, such as physical or emotional trauma. And I bring up the conditions of aging because I think that it is important for parents who do not themselves identify as autistic to realize that they may be sharing some of the same experiences with their children as they age, that their issues with executive function that come with menopause or mild cognitive impairment are very similar, and that can be a source of empathy and understanding between parents and their children. Or for some parents who are younger, like mine were, maybe the recognizing what they see in their own parents and their children may match, and that's nice. And what does executive dysfunction feel like? It feels like getting stuck, not being able to remember what to do next, or not being able to do something that you want to do. Like you're on the couch and you know that you need to eat and you just like can't move. Making a mistake in a repetitive task, or feeling disoriented. And then my favorite one is you walk into a room and you can't remember why you're there. That one, that's a common feeling. Now, metacognition is something that is not discussed in much research related to neurodevelopmental conditions. And metacognition is more studied in education, where they recognize metacognitive strategies as a way to support difficult subjects like reading, writing, and other kinds of arithmetic. And it's also very studied in medicine and like particularly in surgery and in the military and sports. So metacognition is recognized as the explicit strategies you use to get through complicated tasks. And we know that metacognitive strategies, when they are effective, can help with executive dysfunction, but we don't study effective metacognitive strategies for disabled people. Weird. So what happens instead is that the typical kind of metacognitive strategies that exist in society are very like culturally imbued. So you kind of learn them through osmosis. And what happens is that neurodivergent people don't learn them through osmosis. And what a very common experience would be that you get to college and you realize that everybody else knows how to study and you don't. And you're like, I don't understand. I was doing fine. Why is there now this magical skill that everybody has and I don't? So instead, what happens, instead of internalizing these typical strategies for metacognition, people internalize ableism instead. And ableism is the pervasive societal belief that disability is bad, and that any kind of deficit makes you less than. And so instead you internalize ideas about yourself that you're lazy, or that you just procrastinate too much, or that you can't be focused. And you instead of metacognitive strategies, you get these metacognitive beliefs that you're just bad at things. And so, I did a number of in-depth interviews with autistic adults about their experiences with executive dysfunction and managing that with technologies. And some of the most effective strategies that they reported were things like task chunking, which means you take a task and you break it down into smaller steps. Now, this is difficult because if you have a task that seems very overwhelming, you don't know how to break it up, right? But what my participants were telling me was that they actually used friendships and supports to help each other break tasks down. So like you might not be able to see how to break down your one terrifying task, but your friend can. And your friend might not be able to see how to break down their one terrifying task, but you can. And they would do this kind of friendly exchange of executive function. There's also a lot of representing tasks with visual and tactile reminders. And so you see this a lot actually in the services provided for children that offices like, what do they call it here? In Florida, it was a Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. I don't know what Indiana calls it. But if you go to a therapy center that you're working with, and they'll give you like, yeah, you'll get like sheets with pictures and like first then, or like you'll get the how to get dressed chart or how to brush your teeth chart you might see. And so those are very commonly given in childhood. And then there's this thought that like, you can't use them when you're an adult. But what I found is a lot of my adult participants would make their own. And that there's one thing people would say is there's no sticky note police. Nobody's going to come and like take your sticky notes from you and tell you that you can't have those to remind you how to do things. And other like tactile reminders would be using physical objects to represent tasks that you needed to do. I had one participant that would put the toilet bowl brush on top of the seat so that they knew the next time that they had to go to the bathroom, they had to clean it first. And then another one is echopraxia, which many of you may be familiar with a term called echolalia, which is the repetition of words or phrases. And echopraxia is more like flocking. So like being able to mimic the bodily movements of people around you. And what people in adult autistic communities do is we call it, this is really the adult version of the word parallel play. So if you are living in an apartment with other people and they start making dinner, then it's easier for you to make dinner, right? And if you are meeting friends at a coffee shop and they're doing homework, it's easier for you to do homework. And then the most effective metacognitive strategy among my participants was anti-ableism. And this was internalizing a sense of disabled identity and community, and rather than those negative messages about yourself, that you're lazy and that that you procrastinate too much and that you're not focused and that you're not committed or something. And so finding different ways to think about yourself and think about your friends and community as a way to break through some of those executive dysfunction, stuckness things. I forget this is in here. Okay, so this was the chart that I made based on the research. And it's very difficult to read, but I'll just give you well, you can't see part of it. Anyway, it just means that when I analyzed these like 28 people's detailed strategies, right, they fell into 4 domains: mental, embodied, environmental, and social. So that was like the domain in which the strategy is implemented. So mental are like these rules that you make for yourself, okay? These are more traditional in many ways. Embodied are things like recognizing your need for sensory regulation, people understanding that they need to take a walk and come back to their work, doing some heavy work or other kinds of OT-related exercises when you're feeling like you can't do what you need to do. And social has to do a lot with that, supporting each other through task chunking and supporting each other through making dinner together, doing things together, so that, and also in supporting somebody else who has the same condition you do, then you begin to have more compassion for yourself. So an example that's more common in like general psychotherapy for all people is that if you are having really negative thoughts about yourself, a therapist will often say, would you talk to your friend that way? And environmental has to do with controlling space, controlling the sensory environment, and also using objects and reminders like that toilet brush example I gave before. Another example would be that somebody really needed to buy more tea when he went to the grocery store, because that tea is like part of his bedtime ritual, but he would always forget. So he put the tea box by the door. And so he was able to like take the empty box with him and know that I have to buy more of this because my box is empty, or taping bills to your computer monitor so you have to pay them before you do whatever else. And so those are just some examples. Well, since it's not moving, I'm going to go ahead and talk about pets, because there was a big theme about, this wasn't even about service animals per se. It was just like having an animal, and we find this in research for older adults, people that are entering dementia too, like having to care for something, having to care for a plant or an animal helps you take care of yourself. You know, you feed the cat, you feed yourself. You give the cat their meds, you give yourself your meds. You water the plant, you take a drink. And so like this kind of thing was very evident among many of my participants, this appreciation for the companionship and the sort of like mutual support. And so I'm going to bring the mood down. Sorry. And I'm going to read a little bit here, which is kind of annoying. But anyway, we talked about some things that you are all concerned about. We talked about a framework for thinking about some of the problems that we're going to discuss later. I want to talk about what autistic adults are most concerned about. And I did say, so they're most concerned about executive function problems and then this thing, okay? So our life expectancy is 36 years. And the reason for that significantly lower life expectancy than the general population is higher rates of injury. And in that category of injury are high rates of suicide and also filicide. So, but more often, and also medical neglect. So like all of those things come together to reduce our life expectancy. In children, suicidal thoughts and behaviors are 28 times higher than the general population, and it's still 3 times higher in adults. There have been recent research into like why in the 90s, the research just sort of believed that we were predisposed to hating ourselves, which doesn't make any sense. And recent research has found that the major explanation for why autistic people seem to be more overall suicidal is this social stigma that follows them around, the stress of trying to fit in and be like everybody else, and the feelings of failure and shame when they aren't like everybody else. So I'm 38. I told you I was going to make it sad, sorry. And 2 years ago, I turned 36, and I had birthday congratulations on my social media that said things like, you made it, you're an elder now, because the average life expectancy is 36 years old. And there's even a special Facebook group for autistic people that are 36 and older. It's very depressing. And so, as I said before, autistic people are twice as likely to die from unnatural causes as the general population. And this is true whether or not we have co-occurring medical conditions such as epilepsy or cerebral palsy, although epilepsy is actually one of the #1 causes of deaths. So, but when we don't have epilepsy, then this is the problem. And we have these exceptionally high rates of death from injury, like I said before, and you know, all of these very sad statistics about suicide. But what I want to talk about is that, you know, when we looked at the research to figure out why, we found that like the social stigma, the stress of trying to fit in, and feelings of failure and shame were really high up there on explaining why the rates are so high. And so I want to talk about shame for a minute, because shame is a uniquely pernicious emotion. It's impossible to feel shame without other people. A baby does not feel shame. We learn shame from each other, and we pass that shame around like an infection. The things that we are ashamed of are the things we punish other people for. Everywhere in every culture, autistic people are learning to be ashamed of themselves from the people around them, and it's killing us. Now, my parents loved me. I was wanted and I was loved, but they still taught me shame. And they taught me shame not because they were ashamed of me, but because they were ashamed of themselves in ways they didn't understand, and they were afraid. My mother's uncles were all institutionalized. And so she knew that she had the R word baked into her blood, and she was terrified and ashamed that someone would notice me and take me away. My favorite great uncle was Bobby. I got to see him the most. He still lived at home most of the time, but spent a lot of his days in day centers. He liked gardening and landscaping. So when we would come to visit on Sundays, he would be outside his mother's home, trimming the plants. And there were pictures in the house of him holding me when I was a baby, and everybody would always say, "He's so proud of you." He called me porcupine, but sometimes when he was angry, he also called me the R word, because that's what they called him. So when families receive a diagnosis of a developmental disability like autism, all those big feelings that they experience, the worry, the grief, the fear, it's all fueled by shame. Shame fed to them by a society that says there are only certain kinds of children worth celebrating and only certain kinds of lives worth living. Now, I'm sure that you don't think that you're ashamed of your children, and I believe that most of you are not ashamed of your children. But when you worry about their future, about their success, and about the relationships, about their independence, what drives your worry? It's a conviction sold to you by other people that a life that looks different from a happily married, career-oriented adult is something bad, tragic, and to be feared. So in my advocacy work, I'm often hosting series of workshops on managing the cognitive struggles for neurodivergent adults. And so this current work is based on that research and bringing some of these lessons about finding community and abolishing shame to families. So we're going to talk about worries and fears and secret shames, and we're going to talk about how to support our children through this world that wants them to be ashamed. I believe that more connected and liberated families can protect against the shame that has been eating our children alive. Time to be healthy. Okay, so through some of this research, I'm going to talk about cycles of support. And it really does begin in the sensory domain. Somebody cannot regulate their responses and they cannot work through tasks, even the ones that they want to, if their entire central nervous system is on high alert, okay? And then providing task scaffolds like those visual reminders, like these sort of helpful rule sets and these devices that everybody else seems to internalize without any support, we have to make explicit for our children. And then also unconditional positive regard. This is a concept that is talked about by Alfie Kohn, who has some very good books. One is called Unconditional Parenting. And this is the belief that children do well when they can, and that your child is not vindictive or spiteful. And that even when bad things are happening and you're very frustrated, that you still believe in your heart that your child is a worthy human being. And I think most of you do, but I think sometimes when we're fighting with each other, we forget to say it. And then co-regulation. So like I said, if you're upset, it's very hard to help somebody else be not upset. I'm bad at this. I talk about it with my kids all the time. And so they'll be like, "Mommy, you can't talk to me right now, you're upset." And I'm like, "Solid burn, kid." And so it's hard. And then this celebration, this finding, and I want to talk about, I also asked people what were some things about their children that they enjoyed. And it was so lovely to see how many of us find our children to be immensely funny and empathetic. And this is great because we have all this research that says that we don't have empathy. And yet I don't think anybody actually agrees with that if they actually like have a child. And then the funny thing is great because there's always been this stuff about like we don't get jokes, we don't get sarcasm. But if you look, there's a huge increasing amount of autistic comedians, and they're very funny. So anyway, that's kind of this cycle of support. And when you're celebrated and your sensory support systems are accommodated for, it becomes easier to build all these other things, these other skills. Now, this is the next big thing. What your child needs most is community. And so this image is an image of Stacey Park Milburn, who was a disabled activist who lived in the Bay Area in California and was a founding member of an organization called the Disability Culture Club that organized aid and relief for disabled people during the PG&E fires and during early COVID. So when the rolling brownouts were depriving disabled people of the power that they needed to live, Stacey Milburn and all of her friends were organizing pickups and delivery of backup batteries and generators and taking people to safe places where they could have power that they needed to live. In a chapter co-written by Stacey and Leah Lakshmi, Yapsana Samarasana, they had a sort of a mutual discussion with each other, and Stacey said, "Through loving disabled people, I get to love myself." And I mentioned this earlier about, you know, when you're having very negative thoughts about yourself, your therapist will say, would you talk to your friend that way? And when you're able to help your friend through things that you struggle with, you're able to find compassion for yourself. And so it's still very common in clinical care today for parents to be told or encouraged to keep their children away from other children like them. This idea that we will make each other more autistic. I mean, we will, absolutely, and it's great. So, but you know, we need each other, and many of us don't find each other until we are on our own, until we go to college, and many of us fail. I almost failed. Many of my friends did not graduate. Many of my friends are living on SSI. But we still found each other in adulthood, and those kinds of friendships really would have made a big difference in childhood. One of the things that concerns me is I also asked in the survey about how you felt connected to other families and other families with disabled children. And in both cases, the responses are quite concerning in that for the most part, families around here feel very isolated. I experienced this, but I just kind of thought it was, if you didn't go to high school with people around here, they won't talk to you. I don't know what that's about. So I thought maybe that was the reason, but also maybe people are just mean. I don't know. If you don't go to church with them, they won't talk to you. I don't know what the deal is. But so we need each other too. And for families who, you know, families, parents, whether or not you also identify as neurodivergent in some way, you also need adult autistic and neurodivergent friends, because just like your children will benefit from being able to have those friendships, you also will benefit from those friendships. And so we need each other is what I'm saying. And let's try to be friends. So there are some local resources that I want you to know about. Many of these are about equitable access to education. Some of them will also help you with medical discrimination. And so there's the Great Lakes, Midwest, and Plains Equity Center. And there's a branch in Indianapolis. And there's InSource. This is very much a big education one. The Equity Center does education and also sometimes other kinds of Office of Civil Rights kinds of complaints. And then again, like I said, we need each other. And then some other resources, there is an organization called Foundation for Divergent Minds, and it is run by some friends of mine who are autistic and have been in autism advocacy for decades. And they make training materials for parents and professionals for neurodivergent-led therapeutic interventions, and also just support in restructuring the way you think about parenting your children. And there is the Neurodivergent Burnout series, and this is mostly for adults or teens, people in college, and yourselves as adult people. You don't have to be neurodivergent to like this. Anyway, these are videos, and you can watch them, and I'm kind of fun. I don't know, man. People like them. And then, you know, some of you may have taken these surveys already. I just wanted to bring them up again, that if you're local, please take this, this Greater Lafayette Area Autism Community Survey. Purdue has an Autism Research Center. And it's run by people who don't care about the same things that you care about. Every year they have an autism conference, and in that conference is exclusively research related to what causes autism and what does it look like inside the brain. And there's absolutely no research being supported on what is actually going to support the children you have now getting through the society that we have now. And unless I can present enough evidence to support that it is not what the local community wants, then I can't change them. I did trick them into letting me in their club. But anyway, and so this other one that just says feedback, some of you may have taken it already. I would ask you take it again, because there's extra questions at the end about this session in particular. And also I'm looking at some changes over time that people may be moving. Okay. And so that is all that I have for formal content. And now we can talk about specific questions and problems that you want to talk about. And we will do that until they kicked us out of the room. So we have a few people online and we have a few people in the room, and online folks, if you unmute and talk, we can hear you. Or if you want to type in the chat, you can type questions in the chat, and then in people that are physically in the room, they also use your mouths.
Are you gonna email us the slideshow?
Again.
Perfect.
I also will also email the recording to everybody who registered, and the sign-in sheet too, in case, yeah. Yeah, it's the ones that have been recorded already are here. I haven't done, there's like 5 of them. I will be doing more again, but right now I'm focusing on this one. Yeah. And so there's several in there. There's 2 that are just about like executive function in general, like how to adult is hard, how to do things. And then one is like teaching with executive dysfunction, because I do get a lot of academics that show up and they're like, how to do academic things. And I'm like, I don't know. And then there's like a writing one, which, so like those are maybe, you know, depending on who you are, they're not relevant, but they're fun. And then there's on a Substack, which I can send in an email. There is one of them didn't get recorded, but I had the transcript, and so I have like a written out version of it. But yeah. Yeah. The most effective form of diagnosis is to just put you in a room with somebody who has the diagnosis. And I could see it in your face, so I diagnose you.
My daughter's when I was working on, but I was just laughing because in college I almost
no, I almost failed my first semester in college, and managed to acquire a boyfriend who became my personal care assistant, basically, and that's the only way I was able to graduate. And then I did, you know, I'm a doctor, I have a PhD, but I got it 10 years later than everybody else. So I didn't do that until later, and we get so much smarter, all people, not just, like, we get smarter when we're older, like it's way easier. Like I was having a much easier time than my 22-year-old lab mates. They were on the struggle bus, and I was like, wow, you should have gone to work first, because damn. Anyway, that's yeah, hi. You don't have to have a diagnosis to be real. We know that there are so many barriers: the cost, the disbelief, the bias against women, the bias against racialized people, the bias against immigrants and people who speak multiple languages. And it's just a big old mess. And then depending on how you can find, like whether or not you can find somebody who works as a school counselor to do the educational evaluation for a very small amount, sometimes you can. It's like $5,000 otherwise, or like, you know, so like anywhere from $15,000 to $5,000 to get a diagnosis. And it doesn't get you much. Yeah.
Find out until their son was diagnosed.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, hey, wait, that's me.
Yeah.
He's got security. Our house.
Yeah.
And so he asked you and he got his diagnosis when.
Yeah. So the really important thing to know about autism diagnosis is that the oldest person in the United States diagnosed with autism, who was diagnosed as a child, passed away in like 2020 at 86 or something. So like that's how new it is. Okay. My uncles were not diagnosed with autism. They probably had labels like schizophrenia and like, you know, imbecility or some shit. Like, you know, like it's and once they institutionalize you and put you on all those drugs, it's impossible to figure out what's actually going on with you, because Anyway, and that's, so people don't really understand how, and there's all of this, like, well, if you weren't caught as a child, then it's like, well, when we were children, there were still only like 3 clinics in the United States that would diagnose you in the 80s, really effectively. And then in the 90s, we started getting more. But if you were, you know, in middle school or high school in the 90s and maybe weren't being paid that much attention to by the people around you, and then there was nothing. Anyway, it was, so what I mean is it absolutely makes sense that there are so many of these people finding themselves later on. And also, I don't remember, it must have come up in a question last time, because last time I talked about this. All of those studies about where autism comes from, they never screen the parents. And I'm like, who let you do this? Like, scientifically not correct. Why they let you do this is wrong. The very silly things like maternal grandmothers smoking. Do you know who needed to smoke in the 50s? Autistic people. Like, you know, mothers with restricted diets. Who has a restricted diet? Even the Tylenol thing. Who's in chronic pain? We are. It's very silly. So yeah. So there's also this kind of bias in the screening where if you are an autistic parent, whether or not you know it, you may underrate your child because it's like makes appropriate eye contact, I guess. Sure. Like, the first time I took the MChat, it was when I realized I don't think about these things. I was like, it never occurred to me. I have no feelings about this. What do you mean? And like, you know, so those are things that can actually prevent diagnosis. And then at the same time, I made the mistake of thinking that if I got my diagnosis, it would be easier for me to advocate and say that my children have it too. And instead what happened was, no, you're just crazy. Your kids are fine. You're just insane. It's right here on your file. And I'm like, I can be both, right? I can be correct. And also that was not fun. So anyway, yeah. The #1 cause of autism is autistic people fucking. Okay.
I believe, and I just thought of this recently, my dad is probably autistic. And really just,
yeah.
And we're like, you literally just was like, I think you're right.
Yeah.
That before, but I did think my dad probably is, but he's 8.
Yeah.
So back when he was in school,
no, I mean,
beaten because he couldn't comply.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on like that? Like even the next generation above that, like where his parents have this, like what does it look like in the past history? Is there anything?
I mean,
like beyond that generation?
It's very difficult to trace because so many of these ideas about cognitive normalcy are as recent as like 1920s. Like that's almost as far back as you can even go with some of this. And before that, there were institutions, but it was really just this one's weird. Throw them in the box. Like they didn't like classify it. And it's but I mean, I think it's pretty solid belief among autistic people that we've always been here. It doesn't mean that every single person in your tree is, right? Like I'm always terribly disappointed that my father seems to be just ADHD. Like what? But it's you know, it's more like you know, sprinkles. But yeah, there are many things happening. For example, like that there is a social and cultural component in the sense that we wouldn't have as many identified people if we weren't so obsessed with the idea of normalcy, right? And so in that way, the number of people identified as aberrant or deviant is higher. It doesn't mean necessarily that actual statistic wise there are more people. It just means that it becomes more urgently relevant to them in their day-to-day lives because of the social expectations, right? So you know, great grandparents may not have had any trouble because they were just milking cows or something. Like you know, it was just the different expectations. Is that, oh, these are hand raised. Mustafa, you can unmute and ask, or you can type your question.
Hey, Ruad. Hey, thanks for arranging this. So I have a couple of questions. So I have been told that the earlier that you kind of diagnose autism and start the interventions, better the probably the coping capacity would be. Is that true, or what is the typical age that when people diagnose with autism here?
It's really difficult to say, to be honest, and there's several reasons why. The actual quality of the services are so variable that early intervention doesn't always mean the same thing, right? And then there's also the fact that our longitudinal studies, when you put somebody in therapy for most of their week for many years, how can you tell the difference between that and just growing up? I'm not saying that therapy is useless. It's not. I'm just saying that it's weird to be so certain that earlier and more is better. It doesn't really. And so what I really advocate for is paying attention to your child. And if they seem like they are benefiting and that they are happy, then it's fine, right? But if they seem like the therapy is itself some other kind of administrative burden in their lives, if they're basically at a second job, right? When their job is actually to be children, then maybe you can take a break from that if it doesn't seem like it's really making them happy.
Understood.
We have 2 jobs as parents, which is to keep them alive and to let them know that that we love them, right? We don't necessarily have to also keep them miserable if we think that it's supposed to make them better people when they're grown-ups. And so I'm not saying that everybody. So what I'm saying is pay attention to your child. If your child seems like they're having fun, okay. If your child is really miserable and strung out all the time, maybe they don't need to be working, basically.
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Alice?
Thanks, Rua. I have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
How would you recommend talking with kids about their own diagnosis, and where are places that they might, find others who can hang out and, their own community, like the kid level stuff? That's the first one. I'll start with that.
Yeah. So, my advice is you might have the talk about, hey, your brain's weird. But you're going to have the talk multiple times because they're actually very small and they forget. So I have explained to my daughter that she that her brain works differently multiple times. And every time it's she's just hearing it for the first time. And I'm like, okay, do I have to do this every week? Because I didn't know you spent the last 2 years thinking that there was something wrong with you. And it's you got to do it all the time. And when they're having trouble at school, or if they're having trouble with friends, you kind of have to remind them maybe, but I don't ever make it so much of well, you're different, right? One of the other things that I do is, my daughter has a tendency to make friends with mean girls. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but she has a tendency to become attached to somebody who's not treating her very well and to believe with all her might that is her best friend. And if she loses that person, that she's worthless, even though that person is being mean. And so what I try to explain is that the person who's being mean to them that is probably going through something, right? And so I try to help her understand having boundaries around what she will and won't allow friends to do to her, but also still being compassionate to those friends. And so you can still be respectful and kind and loving to the person that's being mean to you without allowing them to continue doing the things that they're doing to you. That is another one of those conversations that you have to have every week or they'll forget. But then there's books that are cute little opportunities for talking about it. There's a book called Not Quite Narwhal. It's a unicorn that's raised under the ocean by narwhals, and then it finds unicorn people. And that's kind of a book that can help. people often use the book Red for this, which is actually a book that's made for explaining like trans identity to children, but people also use it for neurodivergence. Also, a lot of us are both, like so many. So, you know, that helps. There's a library called the Levi Lamitsky Autism Library, and I'm going to find it. What tab is going to open, and how embarrassing will it be? Oh, good, it's just Google. Oh, nice for me. So there's this library, and you can actually like borrow books from it, but also you can just see the list of books and like get them. And it's called the Autism Acceptance Lending Library. And so like you can look through the books that they have, and you can be relatively certain that that's a decent book to buy and read to your kids. You know, there's a book, like a really old kind of classic one is called Johnny Doesn't Flap. Yeah. And it's actually from the perspective of an autistic children that's like, why is that kid so normal? Oh, it's weird. Like, and there's like a silly one, like all cats have Asperger's, and that's from back when that diagnosis was still one that we used. There's a really fun book by Tiffany Hammond called A Day with No Words. It's about a non-speaking autistic boy, and it's really good. And yeah, so there's just all kinds of books that can help with those conversations.
Thanks.
As for the thing I mentioned about we need each other, I would really like to locally plan sort of like autistic kid flash mobs. And what I mean by that is that we all just agree to show up at a place. There's no forced socialization or like activities. It's literally just, we will all be there, and maybe our kids will play with each other or next to each other or something, right? And it's not like a forced activity thing, but like we just say, we're all gonna go to Happy Hollow, or we're all gonna go to the skate park, or we're all, you know, and we just make those dates, and we, you know, we just show up, and then they're able to be in a room full of kids like them, and it's not high pressure or like orchestrated or anything. And it's just, so I'm really hoping to get some people around here to be interested in autistic flash mobs. But also in that other survey about the area, also trying to see interest in specific events that are more like, okay, for the 0 through 12s, and for the 12s through 18s, and through the 18s through 26s, and etc. Like game nights or something that are a little bit more structured. But my prediction is that it won't be as fun as just showing up at the same place. So that's if anybody wants to actually make it happen, because apparently it can't be me, because like nobody talks to me. Like it has to be one of you that has convinced the town that you're normal. It can't be me. You know? Okay, great. Because fantastic. Yeah. You might even be somebody who left a note in there about like something that anyway, we'll find out. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So anyway. Yeah. No, I don't.
We started with some local businesses getting sensory friendly hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, and started around town sensory friendly field trips for preschool kids.
Yeah.
That's the age for the high grandchildren.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So we're really excited.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we're trying our best. Little Star, which is around the corner, is the ABA center my children go to. Their director is getting some information from me so I can start a local chapter.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's just there's nothing. The thing is, in Tippecanoe County, between the ABA centers and the special ed programs, there's 9 of them.
Yeah.
So there's 9 in Tippecanoe County, and you're telling me 9 centers filled with kids, whether they're typically autism, ABA, or if they're special education, there's nothing for them to do.
I
It
know,
doesn't make any sense.
it doesn't.
And I can't have that anymore.
It goes all the way up to adults, it's not just kids.
Yeah.
Like there's,
Right, but
there's 25
Yeah,
years old
Yeah.
plus there, so they,
9
they're
centers.
all, it's a huge center, but they're,
yeah,
so they represent 9 centers.
Blows my mind.
yeah. I mean, I just think there's an overall tendency to stop paying attention to like a community need. And it's just like like everything is a service and not like a,
Their mental health's big.
right,
Enough for us
to
to
do,
tell us the discord.
yeah.
Like, I'm-
Oh, I can make y'all an adult one, but I will not moderate for children. I'm too afraid. Yeah.
Debbie,
Yeah,
I would love to moderate.
yeah.
Collaboration.
Does somebody still have, Alice, is that a new hand or an old hand?
Is a new hand, but I can wait.
No, please tell me what your hand is, because I can talk to these people like when I close down.
Oh, sure. Okay. The second one, I don't know, it might be too niche. One of the things that I appreciate about like you posting on social media, you talk about your store-bought neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
I use a lot of store-bought neurotransmitters in my house. And but the shortages are just killing us.
Yes.
And I wondered how you help your kids or yourself. How do you manage work or school's expectations of you in a shortage of neurotransmitters?
Yeah, I'm actually terrified to say this because I feel like the universe is going to punish me. I haven't been hit by the shortage.
What are you on, man? Because
I'm not telling you. No, I'm kidding. I will tell you in private because it's medical information. But
Sure,
like,
sorry.
but I don't know why it hasn't hit us. One of the reasons could also be for myself that I sometimes forget to refill it. It's so addictive. I can't even remember to take it. Anyway, my kids are just on like basic, like Ritalin twice a day, like basic methylphenidate twice a day.
Yeah.
And they haven't been hit, but it's also like it's a small dose. And one of the reasons why we don't use the extended release for them is that we found it suppresses their appetite too much. And if we give them the 2, then by the time it's lunchtime, they're kind of hungry again, and then they take it after lunch. And then because like my children eat like 5 things.
Yeah.
My oldest daughter eats like 3 things, and she definitely is like ARFID, and it's a big problem. We had to get a doctor's note to let her use the microwave at school because some of the things that she will eat have to be warm in order for her to eat them. And they wouldn't let her use the microwave without a note. Yeah. So that's but yeah, so when you're not medicated, right, it's really difficult. And many of us have experience being not medicated and like you can't make me go back. And so that's just when those metacognitive strategies and those explicit scaffolds and that like sort of peer support is the most necessary, right? But also the expectations of school are unrealistic for everyone. And I do have in our plans some very emphatic, like, no, they don't have to do all 75 math problems because you think it takes 20 minutes, but it takes her 3 hours. Yeah. So you give her 20 minutes of work for her, and then you leave her the fuck alone. And that's in my IEP plans for her, because no. And there is some argument to be made about like time equity, right? This idea that like just because it takes somebody longer that they should have to do it for that long. And it's really just that the idea is 20 minutes of math and not a realizing that for some kids that takes 3 hours, right? And if she gets some of the highest scores in math, even with a significantly reduced workload, because it's not actually necessary. And so that's that sometimes lowered expectations are not what they sound like. This idea that you need to lower your standards or lower your expectations, it sounds like something you don't want to do for your children because you want them to have like the best opportunities and to be their best selves. But actually many of the times what we think of as the standard is not kind to anyone. And it's not lower standards. You're looking for the correct standards. You're looking for the reasonable standards. These are children and they should not be working. School should not be a job. Therapy should not be a job. They're children and they should be able to play. Because that's what's going to make them super weird, is not ever being a child. Ask me how I know. Anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Rua.
Great. So we have like 3 minutes left, and I can take 1 or 2 more questions before I turn it off and start putting up chairs and talking to my new friends. You have other things. She doesn't have a diagnosis yet. It is not quite serious enough for them to. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So that's our next step, is actually we're in the referral line for a gastric psychologist.
I think they will.
Yeah.
We go to
Yeah. That's not true.
Yeah.
Oh,
I said it.
She said, no, it's just a Riley, Dr.
Yeah.
Gilbert. And she said,
So Riley has all kinds of problems, and so you might have to go to Cincinnati, which is a fucking terrifying prospect.
he did not recommend Riley to any special needs
Yeah.
parent. They have gone so touchdown.
Yeah, it's so funny because I said this LEND program is run out of Riley, and they know, like they know that, like, so like they are not really a part of the particular staffers working for LEND, but they're like sort of stuck in this, like, this is where the grant is, and yeah, Riley is falling apart, and most of our families won't stay here. Yeah.
But they won't entertain an onset diagnosis until he goes to a GP clinic, which he said.
Yeah. Yeah.
They said, well,
It can be both,
because I have
asthma and I have allergies. It's like both.
Yeah.
She just asked me.
She said,
"Are you afraid of water?"
what?
That was one of the questions.
Yeah.
He laughed. Because, huh?
He's 6, but his he's like watermelon, and then he starts scripting. Scripting whatever show he watches.
She said, "Are you afraid to eat it?" He's like, "I'm afraid of water." What?
I just refuse. I'm not a.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even his therapists are like, yeah, he does, but they can't do the diagnosis. Gastro psychologist, feeding clinic, they have to do it,
Right.
and they refuse.
Yeah,
And
we're in
we
that
told
time.
his regular gastroenterologist, he can't diagnose.
No.
They also.
Yeah, no, I mean, the only recommendation is you have to go somewhere else. I don't know where to go, but that is literally not true. And then you can complain to, like, there are people that are supposed to be like patient relations or whatever, but I don't think they do anything.
No, I filed a report, they're just letting us know. And that
Yeah.
was-
Now we're on the waiting list to go to Peyton Manning.
Yeah, and so there's this like belief that whenever autism comes into the picture, that everything is behavioral,
Yeah.
and that means that everything can be solved by just making the child do the right thing.
Telling them, yeah, no.
Just do it. Just eat the thing. That doesn't work.
Yeah, this dude trying to give him other.
You.
We always give him credit, even if he won't eat it, I always offer it, but he wants to try food so bad, but everything in his system will not let him.
Yeah.
My daughter's the same way, she gags and throws up, looking at
Yeah.
texture.
No, for a long time, my daughter had to get injections of antibiotics when she was on medicine because she could not take any of the liquids. And like, people didn't believe us. And it was like Exorcist, like her whole body shook and she couldn't keep it in. And it took 3 nurses trying to put Tylenol in her before they believed me. When she couldn't even handle Tylenol, and they were like, "Oh, she like physically can't do it." I'm like, "I told you." And so
I didn't know that was an option, because had to. No, nobody ever said, hey, you give them a shot.
I mean, it hasn't happened here. This was in Florida, but like, and that's not that Florida's better, just, yeah. And this was at the pediatrician, like it wasn't, we didn't have to go to the hospital for it. It was just, you could go do a nurse visit and a shot. They still had to hold her down, but
I had no idea, but now I know. My son, both my children are frequent ear infections.
yeah.
Strep, which my son did get to in waiting. But I didn't know that that was an option. They never ever.
No.
But now that I know.
Right, it is, that's a lot of this stuff. That's another reason why we need each other, is because they won't tell you what's possible. Yeah. And this also brings me to one last thing before I'm going to close it down, which is that in the school system in particular, families are not even just discouraged, but sometimes legally forbidden from talking to each other about the kinds of services that they got for their children. That NDA thing is being debated, but it doesn't come into play until you go to mediation. So unless you're under an NDA, you can talk to your friends and neighbors about what kinds of services your kid is getting. And we should be, because the IEP system is set up in a way that actually puts families against each other fighting for getting more than the other person. And instead, if we came together and said, no, we all want this, right? It actually becomes easier to administer. And it's, it basically is, I'm basically saying unionize, like unionize. But anyway, that is, that's actually the first research project I tried to do when I got here, but like, was to get people to, was to have families come together and try to design like community education plans. But I got through 7 families with special needs children, and none of them were even still in the public school system. So like, so many people are pushed out, but like, it's not even possible. So that I gave up on that for now. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. And I'll send the recording out to you and some more information, and bye. I'll see you around. Bye.